Today is April 4th. 2 days ago, we had Liberation Day, a tariff salvo that doubled as a bid to completely reshape the global economic order. Simultaneously, we had Laura Loomer walking into the White House and firing completely competent NSC staff who were MAGA enough to serve in Trump 1.0, but apparently not MAGA enough for her and the president. What is going on in the Trump administration, and what does it mean for America's relationship to China and its future place in the world? Thankfully, we have the great Tanner Greer of the blog Scholar Stage, who has written a guide for the perplexed. His new report, entitled Obscurity by Design, Competing Priorities for America's China Policy, is the product of dozens of interviews and hundreds of hours reading the thinking of key Trump policymakers that will define America's geopolitical and economic posture for years to come. We'll explore the different strains of thought informing this administration and the longer-term implications of Trump's policy management style. Nicholas Wells, longtime China Talk editor, will be co-hosting. Tanner, what a day. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me on. Yes, it's a when we originally agreed to have this podcast about the report, I mean, I knew it was relevant, but I didn't know it would be this relevant.
All right, Tanner, let's start with tariffs. How did we get here, and what does this tell us about the Trump administration?
This is what I spend the first part of my report talking about, is how do we kind of model Trump's behavior making, decision making, and why is it sometimes so difficult to like predict what he's going to do? And I kind of say there's two reasons for this. The first is that Trump wants to be unpredictable. I think by disposition or personality type, he enjoys and basically being somewhat impulsive and difficult to deal with. But over the course of his life, and especially his first presidency, he came to realize that the less people know what he's going to do, the better off he seems to do. I mean, whether or not that's true for the country as a whole, but at least for him personally, there's a lot of advantages that accrue to being this kind of unpredictable, crazy machine where inputs come in and we don't know what's going to come out the other side. He believes this gives him negotiating leverage. He believes that this makes his strategies sure and more likely to succeed. And there's something self-serving about this. But he has taken this maybe disposition and elevated it to an official philosophy.
Totally, Tanner. In an interview in the lead up to the 2024 election with the Wall Street Journal editorial board, he told them that there's no way that she was going to invade Taiwan because, quote, she knows I'm fucking crazy.
Yeah, that was his exact quote. So when it comes to the Chinese in particular, but world leaders generally, he wants them to think he is crazy. He wants them to think he could do just about anything. You can understand a lot of his behavior as acting in such a way to make that belief credible. He's not the only president who's ever thought that. Like Nixon had the same idea. If I'm mad enough, I'll be able to make things happen in the world. The enemies, rivals will be more likely to do what I want. And so this is a key part, in my view, of why Trump does what he does, is that he actually just believes that if he nails himself down, if he ties his hands by explaining out, this is what I'm going to do, this is how I'm going to do it in any detail, that will work against him. And people will commit him to promises he doesn't necessarily want to keep in the future, and it will remove his negotiating leverage in the future. And he often views international relations as a set of iterated negotiating patterns, as opposed to like you're chatting a big long-term strategy where you're trying to get from A to B, and here's all the little inputs we're going to plug in to get there. Instead, he views things much more iteratively. I'm trying to improve my position, tomorrow, the next day, the next week, and so forth.
We've got a lot of competing impulses, right? You have these visions that have populated the GOP where, big tariffs need to happen in order to raise revenue, in order to do better negotiating, in order to revitalize manufacturing, in order to decouple us with China. And then you have this iterative game that Trump enjoys playing. And I think the kind of mess of, a lot of these tariffs seem to kind of be, even though this is a thing that Trump has been focused on for a very long time, it seems pretty like slipshod the way this was rolled out, as opposed to something like the progressive squeezing of Ivy League universities and law firms, which does seem to be a lot more kind of cogent with it. It's interesting to me that tariffs, which is clearly something he has been focused on for a very long time, the rollout has not been a cogent one, but been a much more sort of like, I don't know, fly out, like, ADD craziness.
So I think there's essentially two reasons for this. One, which is kind of what I said, that Trump believes that increasing like the uncertainty ratio of like what will happen next, what he will do, is to his strategic advantage. He clearly believes this on an international sphere. But there's also a management style problem that is involved here. And Trump doesn't view it as a problem. He views it as the way in which he should do things. His strong preference is to have a team with conflicting opinions. He wants personal loyalty. But as long as he has loyalty, he prefers to have strong personalities who have, in some ways, widely divergent opinions on what should happen and how it should happen. And his management style is to pit these people against each other, pit these factions against each other, and then act as the kingmaker, who then kind of swoops down and chooses the winner of these various different discussions. And this is kind of, you could think of it as his way of solving the principal agent problem, right? Like, how do you keep a bureaucracy in line when it has its own interests? Well, if you can pit other parts of it against each other, that's how he likes to do. And this style, I mean, it has some advantages. Multiple people who I interviewed, and as part of writing this report, I interviewed more than 30, former Trump officials, people involved in this process from the cabinet level down. They point out that, like, that's in some ways very different from like how Condoleezza Rice ran the NSC in the lead up to Iraq, where there was this attempt to find a consensus position and present to the president instead of like allow the arguments to go directly up to the top. And if you are a Republican whose goal is to not repeat the George W. Bush experience, you can understand why that might be attractive even to some people in the administration itself. The weakness here is twofold. The first one is that it's difficult to do long-term planning. It's difficult to have long-term coherence, month to month, day to day, over time. And the second thing is that you run the risk of having competing priorities, competing ideas of what you want to have accomplished, get bound up into the same policy, because the president is not starting out by saying we want to go this way. Instead, he's letting things kind of come up to him, and he's not always making decisive decisions between the various options given. So you'll end up with a situation where multiple people will be supporting the same policy for conflicting reasons. Yeah. And I suspect when we look at how the tariff situation has gone between now and or between the start of the administration and today, that's part of the story here. There's multiple different groups who have different rationale for what tariffs should be, what they hope to get out of economic policy, especially regarding China, but economic policy broadly. And I don't know if the administration has been successfully able to integrate all these different views into a coherent policy.
It seems at least plausible that ChatGPT outputted their formula for determining reciprocal tariffs. Like, there are people supporting the tariff idea, but for conflicting reasons. So they settle on this formula, which is simple enough, but it's not how one would normally calculate a tariff rate that another country imposes. Is this policy how you get that kind of outcome? Or something else?
So there's certainly been for a long time this idea, and many people have been saying this for months and months, years, that one, you need something like reciprocal tariffs, and that lots of countries are, doing things unequally. But also two, that you need to like have something else in addition to those reciprocal tariffs, like have it be truly measured, because countries will have, all kinds of restrictions and their own industrial policies and things like that don't make the playing field equal. And that's plausible enough. The question is, if you were given a deadline to calculate the entire world's kind of on a bespoke basis, all those different policies that might, make trade advantages, or might make trade relations less advantageous or less fair in some way. I think that's quite hard to do. And I don't have any special insight on how the process for creating these happened like this week. All I can say is that I'm pretty sure it happened this week.
Yeah.
Media reports
which is just
from a week ago.
Which is just a wild thing. And, you know, it comes back, I think, like, you know, we have all these competing theories of what's going on and how they, you know, how it's going to revitalize manufacturing or whatever. But there's this famous note that Trump wrote to like a Sherpa at a G7 meeting where he goes, trade is bad. And the concept of like a trade deficit being America is losing and getting cheated is something that has been a long-standing theme of, I don't know, his like intellectual arc. Aside from like the whole like, did ChatGPT come up with the formula? Like basing it on trade deficits as like the thing we are trying to correct for does actually kind of line up with Trump more than it lines up with any of these, you know, big 3D chess. We're gonna like remake Bretton Woods type thought processes that we've seen come out of the GOP ferment over the past few years.
I think that's in some ways correct. I think though that like if you look at these tariffs, they're actually not that far from what Trump said on the campaign trail he wanted to do. So Trump said two things on the campaign trail very persistently. First, he said, I want something like 10% tariffs across the board. Second, I want something like 60% tariffs on China. Those were two things. He said those two numbers on multiple occasions.
Yeah.
And if you look at the numbers that we have, so China effectively, between what they did earlier and what they're doing now, has effectively a 60% rate that's being added to it. And then if you look at everybody else, more or less what you have is you have 10% applied everywhere. And then you have on top of that, this like reciprocal tariff stuff that you know, in some cases it has these really kind of large numbers like Vietnam. Some countries are much smaller. And my guess, and this is just an educated guess, I haven't talked to anyone in the administration in like the last week. You know, they're all too busy right now to have this conversation with me. And I'm not going to pester them.
Steve Bassett, you're welcome to come on China Talk. I don't think it will be fun. I would not recommend it, but you know, the offer's open.
I suspect, if I had to guess, like the logic, even Trump's logic, is something like this 10% is going to stick no matter what. And then all those other numbers are maybe negotiating leverage. Now, negotiating for what? This is an interesting question, to which, again, I'll kind of come back to my earlier point, like, what are you actually trying to achieve? And I think there's multiple different answers to that. But I suspect that what Trump wants to have happen is to have all these leaders of the world basically come and kowtow and be like, okay, what do we need to do to get closer to that 10 and not be at whatever? And for some countries, like Cambodia, like, I don't know what they could do really in a trade sense. You know, they could maybe say something like, well, we'll also kick the Chinese out of the Siem Reap naval base or whatever. If that's the sort of thing that Trump cares about, if that's the sort of thing that USTR is willing to like muddy the water with. But I think they're probably just in trouble. Whereas a country like Japan, I think has a lot more room to do that sort of negotiating back and forth.
Here's the thing though, Tanner, like you do something like this and you expect everyone to play the game that you want to play, right? Trump wants this to be an iterated game and he wants to have a lot of fun calling folks and like cutting deals left and right. But there is a point where you do this enough times and people get sick of you and don't want to play anymore. Is there a breaking point? Like at what point, if ever, do countries just say they're no longer interested in, I don't know, kind of being on America's global ledger from a geopolitical and economic perspective, if this is the way that they're going to be treated?
I mean, the question is that even possible? If you're Japan, to take an example here, economically, is it possible not to be on the American ledger? Militarily, is it possible not to be on the ledger? I don't know if it really is. If you're a country like Vietnam, Militarily, geopolitically, I think, yes, it is easy to balance away. Economically, much more difficult. I just think like a lot of these countries, if Trump's calculation is that because we have the consuming power, because our economy is so essential to the world economy, that a lot of these countries will have no option but to face the music. I think in the short term, especially, that's somewhat true. The question is more on the long term, does this basically create conditions where lots of countries on the 10-year term say, okay, maybe we should look towards something more like autarky for ourselves, or maybe we should balance away towards some other version. And I can see that as maybe a realistic response from some of these countries. But on the short term, I don't think there's we're not going to play with the United States anymore. I don't think it's possible. I think in a 20 year, maybe.
Because, there were some expectations that you could make about America, really post 1945, right? That like, this is a country who was excited to trade with you and, help make you rich. And, insofar as Trump's idea that trade is bad and other countries are ripping us off and we have no interest or no, like it is not at all a part of America's strategic vision that like the countries that we're friends with, we also want to sort of succeed economically. That's a very fundamental shift. And yes, on a 10, 15 year calculus, it may make you really question some assumptions.
I think I would actually rephrase what the problem is. I anchored this first part of the discussion talking about how Trump enjoys and finds strategic value in uncertainty. And in my mind, the truth is when you look at most foreign countries, what they want from the United States, those who are in our alliance system, as well as those who are major trading partners, the vast majority of what they want in the United States is just actually certainty. They want to know what will happen, at what speed, in what way, so they can kind of prepare. It's like, there's the phrase about how, it's no fun to be a mouse among fighting elephants. And if you're a mouse, you really want to know where the elephant is going to be stepping. Trump believes that he has a lot of advantages to not letting anyone know where he's going to step. And I think that if you're an American ally, I actually believe that the ability of American allies to like accept a lot worse conditions relative to what they've been given is actually pretty high. What I think that will be much harder for them to do is to not know what conditions they can accept at any point in the future, right? Which kind of goes back to your question, like when do people decide they want to leave the game? I think that if they're not given some actual sort of enduring deal that they believe this is what the new reality is, and they can assess those terms and say, okay, this is the new reality, we do this, or we do, the Chinese way or whatever, and they can make that decision. But if the way is, okay, the Chinese are very stable in what they want, but the Americans are all over the place, we don't know what they're going to say, not just administration to administration, but month to month, year to year, that's, I think, going to be a bigger problem. And that will be even more than just treating the allies as if they're not, treasured allies that share values and all these other nice things. I think that this sort of capriciousness or arbitrariness, if they perceive it to be as such, if it doesn't seem to come from any principles which they can discern, predict, and act upon, that will cause issues on the long term.
Yeah. And so I guess the question is, Tanner, like, can you come back from something like this? We had big fights in Trump 1, and then we had USMCA, and that was, his vision of the greatest deal since sliced bread. You talk a lot about how the sort of constellation is ever changing, and there are winners and losers, and they don't necessarily happen for policy reasons. They often happen for personal reasons. But I mean, if this is the most fun thing for him, is playing these games and having a negotiation and 3 months later reopening it and trying to get more. Like, is this just the base case for the next 4 years?
I don't necessarily think so. I mean, I don't know. This is an interesting case because we have a lot of data on how Trump ran the last administration. That was a whole year. 4 whole years of how it worked. And one of the interesting questions is, have the way things have worked for the last 3 months, are they more predictive than how things worked for the 4 years previous? And there's some discontinuities. Like a big one, like take these tariffs. When Trump announced the China tariffs in the first administration, they were in installments. They started small. They were well in advance. It was known it's going to be at this level, this level, this level, this level, this level, going up as we had kind of graduated pressure against the Chinese. It was not 25% tariffs on this country tomorrow.
Yeah.
And one of the questions you kind of have to ask is, okay, what's the difference between the two administrations? Why did the first one have this kind of like more measured response, whereas the second one does not? Even if you're kind of playing the same game, I think the markets responded much better to the first one because they had time to plan and to prepare. And I think you could say a few things. Bob Leitzinger isn't here right now. He had extremely respected individual. Had Trump's here. He was good at talking to Trump, getting Trump to say what he wanted to do. And he was very much of the mind that if we're going to do a tariff schedule, we're going to do it above board. It's going to be completely legally nailed down so that the courts don't challenge us and bring it down. We're going to go slow. We're going to go measured, but we're going to do it. I'm not sure that the corresponding figure the corresponding figure on trade policy in this administration seems to be Howard Lutnick. And he doesn't seem to have that same sort of like slow and steady wins the race sort of personality. Right. So, I mean, this is just an outside observer. I don't have special insight on how it is, but just based off of what I've seen him say, the media reports say, it seems like he wants to push maybe faster than USTR did in the previous administration. And so there's like a version of this where, okay, well, if he leaves, then maybe things shift somewhere else. I could see that.
The whole idea of like you just apply a new coefficient of shitty staff work to all the policy making. So it's you both have like the Trump madmen, I want to be on the phone hustling people, and you have like poor execution. So whatever outcome you're trying to get, you can just apply like a 20% discount because you're going to do stuff like tariff penguins. And, when you have an exemption for semiconductors, you're going to put it on CPUs instead of GPUs. So like clearly they wanted to have some carve out for AI, but they just like did it wrong. And the last minute staff work so that like you're, blowing up Madagascar's economy. And it's not like America's going to be growing vanilla beans in the US anytime soon to compensate. And like, if you are going to let Laura Loomer fire people, are you going to get better staff and like better execution out of it? Probably not, right? So that seems like a concept we can hold.
If this is a question just about like, is the Trump administration version 2 going to be competent? I mean, I think that's a slightly different question from what is it they want to do, right?
Yeah.
Or what is it that people inside it want to do? And I'm sympathetic to the argument that like what they want to do doesn't matter if they can't do it well, especially if you're doing something like trying to, rejigger the global trading economy. In preparation for this, I reread the council, the guy, Stephen Morin, he's the Council of Economic Advisors chair for the Trump administration. He wrote this big thing in December about how we should, it's like a 40-page paper, all kinds of academic citations about how we should use trade as a leverage to redo Bretton Woods, redo the existing financial trade order to be more in favor and more sustainable, more in favor to American manufacturers, more sustainable for American budgets, so on and so forth. And I think it's a pretty smart and very interesting approach. But what struck me in reading it now is how he talks a lot about how when we do this, we need to be cautious and careful. when we do this, we need to be slow and graduated, just like we were during Trump 1. He says that a lot. He says, just like we were during Trump 1, we need to do it that way, just more ambitious. And obviously, not everybody has his same agenda. And he's not in charge of any, he's not in the cabinet. He's not on a decision-making authority. That's a consultative body that he runs. But it does kind of point to the weaknesses of some of these approaches. It's if you were doing this in a measured way, I wonder if the responses would be the same throughout the commentariat or if they would be different. I suspect for many people it'd be the same. They'd be just as upset no matter what. But I think the markets would probably respond differently. I don't think you'd have the big run on the markets today, that you've had if there was a slower, measured, more carefully articulated version of what's happening.
This idea of temporal claustrophobia, something we've covered in China Talk in the context of like Japan bombing Pearl Harbor, Hitler invading the Soviet Union, is this idea that sort of the walls are closing in on your strategic, or your ability to like realize your strategic vision, and like every day you wait lowers your percentage chance of like making the world you want to live in. And then you end up, blundering into some of the worst strategic errors in world history. So I do find it interesting how Trump and JD and a lot of other folks talk about what they're doing on the economic and geopolitical side as the clock really almost about to run out, and we need to act big. We need to act fast now. Otherwise, America's fiscal health is shot. America's ability to sort of throw its weight around the world is a wasting asset, and we need to use it now while we still have the chance. Thoughts on that, Tanner?
Yeah, I think that you can look at this at different levels of analysis. At the level of like individuals who have programs, one of the things my report emphasizes is that historically, Trump administration has been Trump goes through people quickly. What is policy today will not necessarily be what's policy tomorrow as these people kind of change. And this does incentivize individuals with a program to, one, implement that program as soon as possible, and number two, to implement it in ways in which it's hard to reverse. This is one reason why you might have a penchant for drastic actions. Say something like, let's just get rid of U.S. aid on questionable legal grounds, but let's just get rid of it so that when people with other opinions come in later or when Congress gets their act together, there's not going to be a chance to really like reverse the situation. And in some ways, this tariffs looks a bit like that. That's one way to look at it. Another way is to look at Trump personally. This is his last administration. This is his last chance. If he's going to make, people keep talking about, he'll try and do a third or whatever. But I don't like the fact that he's moving so fast in my mind is actually evidence that he doesn't see it that way. He wants to make the changes he wants to make, and he believes it will have impacts. Impacts need to be seen soon. That's true too. And then there's this kind of broader question that if you are really interested in upturning the global trade order, the global political order, the national federal government's way of working, I think a lot of people fear that if they do things slow, all they're doing is giving ammunition to enemies and getting veto points, like people who might have veto points in the process, giving them the chance to activate it. You need to move before that world of resistance is summoned. And I think that's probably a direct lesson learned from the first administration, where all the time things the first administration wanted to do were frustrated, sometimes for good reasons, often for completely crazy reasons, right? That you would have things all over the place, kind of very slowed, frustrated. And I think that leads Trump and a lot of people around him to be like, okay, we can't be like the first one. We have to just go in and do things, screw staff work, right? This needs to be done. And it's more important to do the big thing and get directionally in the right direction than it is to look like we're doing the right thing, but never actually have it happen because there's enough chance if we go slowly for veto points in the bureaucracy, within Congress, and so on to react. And that probably goes back to Trump's whole philosophy too, of like, I'm much better off. People don't know what I'm going to do. If I just act and everyone has to react, that's how he prefers things. And doing things slowly, doing things in a measured way, forces you to react to others just as much as they react to you.
There was like this one, the Trump put, right, of like, okay, the market goes down enough, Trump will stop being crazy. Like that was like a breaker that you saw for the first administration, which is basically gone now, or we'll see. This is our first real test, I guess. But the sort of psychological shift manifested in that in particular, I think is a really interesting
I think it's mostly gone, although it will depend a lot on how the markets look over the next 6 months or so. I think Trump earnestly believes that there's going to be a period of problems that will, but not forever. And so, I mean, I don't know. If we have a recession that lasts 2 years, I think there'll be a lot of rethinking on his part.
Assuming there will be rethinking is one of the like
I don't predict which way that rethinking will go. I think there will be rethinking on his part because that's constantly been one of the truths of Trump in power. He's always rethinking. He's very, very, he doesn't stick to ideas or people. And so, he sticks to some very big level ideas, immigration, trade, not so great, but he has a lot of flexibility in his persona, and his base lets him get away with a lot of flexibility in what he wants to do. And so I think that the expectation that what he does now is exactly what he's going to do in 2 years is almost certainly false. The uncertainty for everybody else, though, is like, in which way will it diverge? And there's many paths.
Yeah. I mean, okay. So I had like a very off color comparison. I was rereading Ian Kershaw's Hitler biography last night, particularly like the last 200 chapters. And it's it's like April 1945. The walls are closing in. This is Ian Kershaw writing about Speer's memoir, saying, Hitler at the time gave an intimation that the German people might not deserve him, might have proved weak, have failed its test before history, and thus be condemned to destruction. It was one of his hints, whether in public or private, among the continued outpourings of optimism about the outcome of the war, that Hitler indeed contemplated, at least momentarily, the possibility of total defeat. So I don't okay, you've talked me out of this, Tanner, but I do see a world in which there is like a King Lear Trump polling at 10% in 2027, just like, fuck it, I want to burn the whole world down timeline, which we shouldn't entirely discount.
I think that's not the thing I would be worried about. The trouble with Trump running at 10% in 2027 is not the world needs to burn down. It's that he's going to worry that if he loses if a Republican doesn't win the election afterwards, he's going to jail. That's going to be his worry. I think the difference between someone like Hitler and Trump is Hitler was extremely ideological, right? Trump, Hitler has this whole thing of like, oh, the people don't deserve me and my brilliance. I don't think Trump thinks like that about himself. He's much more of it's kind of like, saying P.T. Barnum doesn't, like, if people aren't going to his show, like being like, oh, it's obviously because they didn't deserve the goodness I was about to show them. No, he's more like, oh, I played my hand wrong. They didn't believe my game. I think Trump is much more
and he'll just find a new act. Yeah.
Well, he might not be able to. He'll also be older and all this other kind of stuff. But I think that like this sort of messianic thinking is certainly there on the right. There are certainly people on the right who are like that, who think that way.
Yeah.
I don't think Trump is that guy himself. It just doesn't mesh with anything I know about his character, where he thinks, he probably does think I'm somewhat God's gift to like humanity. God saved me in some sense, but I don't think he thinks that like, oh, I am the embodiment of an abstract ideology that the people just weren't ready to receive yet and weren't ready to purify themselves for in the grand struggle. I don't think that's how Trump thinks of the world at all.
All right. Fair enough. You've convinced me, Tanner. For the record, I did ask ChatGPT for better analogies, and it didn't have one that I liked. Let's talk about actual things that people in Trump world believe. I mean, I guess maybe Laban's wrong, but anyways, let's focus on the economic dimension. We have two axes that you chart Trump world economic thinking on. One focused on industrial renaissance versus sort of like emerging technology advancement, and another axis that is focused on that believes that the administrative state can do things, and another that thinks the administrative weak is by definition weak and ineffective and like not a useful tool for changing the world. Tanner, talk us through this this quadrant of thinking. Maybe assign some human beings to better populate our four corners for us.
Yeah, sure. I think the first thing to emphasize here is that there are certain things that every MAGA person kind of has some consensus on when it comes to like the economic vision they want for the future. And as I frame it in the report, especially the economic vision with China, because the way people frame it when they're talking about China is that we need to win the economic competition with China. And what does that winning mean? It usually means some sense, like a word that comes up a lot is some sense of independence. There's this sense that the United States is too dependent on the world abroad, and it's not free. Or to use Trump's word from earlier this week, it's not liberated. He said this himself, that this is going to be a new Independence Day declaration. And the idea there is that all these ties with foreign countries mostly just tie down our hands. Mostly just like make it so that we are dependent for basic goods, for basic things that are secure to our national security, that are core to the future of our economy, that we can only have these if we treat other countries properly. And that we want a world in which American strength and American wealth is not dependent on the goodwill or the good graces of foreign countries, but rather the reverse, where foreign countries' prosperity and security is dependent on our goodwill. That's more or less the unifying vision. So the question then is like, well, how do you get there, and what does that mean specifically?
So staying on the unifying vision for a second, it's this vision of, that's an autarkic dream, right?
No, I don't think it's necessarily autarkic.
Okay.
It can be autarkic, but so the point there is like, who is depending on the good graces of who is more or less the argument there, right? Like, is everybody... So, I mean, as an abstract idea, America in 1946 is the entire world's economy, has a lot of trade relations with the whole world because basically the whole world is buying our stuff. I don't think any Trump person looks at America 1946 to 1955 on the economic side and says, oh, yeah, like that was terrible. They in some ways look at that and say, no, that's great. If we could have that world where America is the world's factory and everyone's buying from us and they can cut off us, but we can't cut off them, then they'd all be fine with that. And I think the question there then becomes, what level of autarky is needed in a world in which other countries are more rich? What stuff do we need to replicate at home? What stuff can we maybe get abroad? But generally speaking, all quarters basically agree that globalization reduces America's field of action. And in particular, this is dangerous because globalization is mostly redounded to the benefit of China. And not only have we, it would be one thing if we were giving up all this capability to Japan and the EU, which a lot of them view as a big problem. Even worse if it's going to China, which is mostly what has, that's the lion's share of the story of what has happened, is that China is the one that has gained a lot of these capabilities that America is now dependent on. And so if you have a geopolitical rival upon which you are economically dependent, that is a problem in their mind. Are there some 1930s vibes to that? Yeah, a little bit. But I don't think the vision is complete autarky.
In each of the four quadrants that you have for economic policymakers in Trump's orbit, what is the limiting principle in each of those? Like, I think maybe dynamists, people in the lower right quadrant, people who are skeptical of the administrative state's capacity and want tech revolution, they might say, we need to reshore manufacturing of critical national security things like chips. And then people on the other side of the spectrum might say, like, I don't know, we need to reshore tons of manufacturing capabilities. Like, is the limiting principle, is it like, do we need to reshore T-shirts for American national security as well? Like, where does each camp draw the line as to what we need to bring back to America?
I think that's a really good question for kind of getting at the divides between the camp, right? Especially this kind of question I have. So, like, my first axis of that kind of divides the group is the people who view winning the future, securing American national security, taking control of the commanding heights of the 21st century economy in terms of developing new technologies or being at the leading edge of new technologies versus those who like want a much wider spread industrial renaissance. And you kind of think of it as a spectrum with like extremes on each end. So at the most extreme version is going to be the guy who basically thinks the only thing that matters is AI. Nothing else really matters. But if America wins AI, then everything else just kind of falls into place. And there's nothing that really needs to happen for AI except for us to make sure that, OpenAI has the money and the energy that they need. Or Anthropic or whatever. And then on the complete opposite side, you're going to have someone who's going to be like, we need everything, including T-shirts. In reality, most people are not on either of those extremes. But that's kind of the spectrum, right? And so I tend to find that people on the right half, people in my right two quadrants, or the leading tech side, they tend to, I would say, either come from national security backgrounds or come from tech investment backgrounds, sometimes finance as well. And their model of the world, the way they think about this problem, well, we'll start with the bottom right corner, the dynamists in particular, who like, this is somebody, like, to choose a very prominent example, someone who's outside of the administration, who's like written very publicly, someone like Mark Andreessen, I would definitely put there. And there's lots of people from his circle who kind of gone into the administration, and you can kind of see where they've done. But they look at American success over the last 30 years, 40 years, and they say that the successes of that time need to be replicated. There's this chart that went viral on tech Twitter a few months ago that showed the productivity gap between the United States and Europe between 1990 and now. And it basically shows that the Europeans have not had very much gain in labor productivity, whereas the Americans have almost tripled it. And this is one explanation for what has happened to the American economy, why it's so much better than the Europeans. In the year 2000, people thought the EU might be up at the American level, and it just hasn't been. And the answer these people will give is, well, it's because America had the most important firms and the most important technological advancements of that time. We had Apple, we had Meta, we had Amazon, and we have Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley, as focused on specific firms, they often think about this in terms of firms, that we want to make sure we have the winning firms for the future. They're going to implement the next round of a technological revolution. And if those firms are Chinese, that like productivity gap that you see between the EU and the United States, that's going to be China and the United States. And so we need to make sure our firms are it. And the rest of the story doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we have, T-shirts. It probably doesn't even matter if we have steel. We can import that from somebody else. What matters is that the firms that will capture the largest percentage of global growth in the future, and those are going to be the ones at the forefront of new technologies. Those ones need to be us. And so when they look at like what these suite of technologies will be, obviously AI. There's concern about things like semiconductors and stuff like that, especially if in the future the Chinese might cut us off or something along those lines. There's things like quantum computing, things like automated systems, things like robotics, UAVs, new energy, aeronautics, and space. That's the realm in which these guys kind of think. And the guys on my top right, I call it the techno-nationalists, they have a very similar perspective, but they're even more national security oriented. A lot of their argument is less about we need to have the firms that have the most economic growth and more about we need to have the technologies that will have like military applications in the future. And we need to make sure we're pouring national resources into that.
And then on the two left quadrants, the people who are in favor of an industrial renaissance, you write in your report that people in those camps see Silicon Valley not as this model of like productivity success, but as a cautionary tale.
So there's a national security oriented way in which they see them, and there's like a more economic and political way. Let's kind of start with that. The economic political thing is Trumpism in some ways starts out because certain parts of the country feel like they've been left behind by this fantastic economic growth that we just described that happened between 1990 and then 2015. If you are a person in West Virginia, Buffalo, New York, Winesburg, Ohio, places like that, the vast increases in American productivity and the lowering of consumer prices haven't been sufficient to offset what you've lost in deindustrializing of your areas. And so as a practical political matter, these guys point out that if we don't have an economy that meets the needs of these people who live in these swing states and are at the core of our movement from its very beginning, then we're doing something bad. There's that. There's the economic, and then it will just create even worse populist eruptions in the future if we can't meet this need. There's the economic argument on top of this, which is that a lot of these guys look at China and say, if you look at Chinese economic advances, there was this idea that you could, in the past, have you could have American companies doing design, and then you could export the middle tier, the hard tier construction, off to countries like China. And that you would still be able to be a leader in design and in software, the user end experience and the design experience, all the middle stuff we can take to a country like China or other countries that are in the middle of industrializing. And that will make things cheaper, and we don't really have to worry as long as we're at the leading edge. And a lot of people who are studying the Chinese economy now, and like if you read a magazine like American Affairs or you look at American Compass, you'll see a lot of this stuff kind of percolate up. They make the argument that this is really not true. That actually, if you are doing really well at the production, you will soon have the skills needed to not only produce, but also to design and engineer and develop the backends. And that's what's happening in China right now. That's more or less their argument. And so if we follow this Silicon Valley way, where we just focus on, like Apple, focuses on the user end experience and the design, but then exports the hardware part to foreign countries because it's cheaper, we're going to end up where you have Huawei and Xiaomi and all these little companies that are leapfrogging America in developing new technologies because they have both design and engineering experience. And that's the story of like EVs or whatever. That's kind of the logic there.
So that's how we go from Vivek saying, we should tariff the hell out of China, but it's okay to do friendshoring, and no, we also need 50% tariffs on Vietnam because those factories should be in America, not in these other countries who don't even like us anyways. And
well, that's right.
Thank you.
And I think it depends on the particular thing. I mean, so a country like Cambodia or Vietnam, I mean, that's producing T-shirts half the time. Right, especially a country like Cambodia or Laos or whatever. And that's probably the hardest argument any of these people have to make. But if you're talking about major like electronics or things like steel, these guys will say you need to have this, they like to use this phrase, like a functioning industrial ecosystem, right? Where you have overlapping companies, overlapping supply lines, engineers inside your country that will develop these new technologies. And then they'll add a national security point on top of this, which is that if there is a war, especially with China, it's really dangerous not to have like even basic things like steel and aluminum not being produced inside our own country. If it's being produced far away, that can be targeted in a war, It can be, if it's being produced in China itself, then we won't have access to it. We need to have this capacity at home. And so that's kind of the people on the left-hand side of the argument, is that we need to have much more of this stuff here. Otherwise, we'll have bad effects in developing new technology and meeting the political and economic needs of like average people across the country and in securing national security.
Nick,
Let's say you're an old school Republican and you still really like the ideas of free markets and tax cuts and deregulation. If you want to get in, if you want to be influential to Trump, which camp are you going to affiliate yourself most with to try to be in his orbit?
If you're an old school free marketer, probably the group that you have the most easiest affiliation with is probably the bottom right corner, which I call the decentralists. So as a reminder, like the top and bottom of the graphs, like this is basically people who believe that government should be used for conservative ends versus people who believe that they're really skeptical the government can be used that way. And people on the bottom right, like they believe in this new technology paradigm, and they also believe that the government mostly just needs to get out of the way. And so their program is like, we can have a lot of like economic growth and develop these new technologies if we just get rid of regulations. If we do all this like abundance NEPA reform stuff is kind of in line with what a lot of these people say. Certainly it's in line with like a lot of what the Doge people think and have been doing, that really the big problem is that we have inefficient bureaucrats, that we have all these DEI things holding down the economy, holding down foreign companies, that we have, kind of crazy 1970s environmental regulation rules. We'd obviously have nuclear power plants everywhere already if we didn't have that stuff. And so that's kind of their tack. And a free marketer can find work with them pretty easily, although I think in terms of like personalities, they would often clash because a lot of these guys kind of come from tech perspectives where they're very not old school in their way of thinking and talking. But in terms of like actual policies envisioned, that's where someone like Vivek is at, right? And he says, yes, we should have tariffs, but only for the perspective of reshoring key national security stuff. Otherwise, our goal is just to take the government out of the economy.
Are we looking at a post-free markets America for the foreseeable future, or is there going to be a swing back?
And they'll probably swing back in time, especially if, like, I don't know, we have a Great Depression style thing. I mean, a lot of time, free market swings are the result of like swings in the reverse, right? They're reactions. And if liberalism, and I mean like economic liberalism, seems very outdated to people, it usually doesn't once it's not being tried. So I think that's a certain possibility. I think in Trump world, there's not a coherent answer to this, partially because you have all these different positions, right? So on the top half are the people who believe that actually Republicans have been wrong since Reagan times, and that we need to have some sort of much more serious intervention in the economy in support of building the new economy of the future. And there's generally two precedents that are cited for this. People in the top right corner, those kind of like national security hawkish folks, those techno nationalists, they're very apt to look back at like Cold War style interventions in the economy for the sake of creating new technologies. And they know there's a lot of those. A lot of technologies are basically the marriage of government and the private sector for national security needs. They say, well, if it worked for us in 1950, why won't it work now? People in the top left corner also believe that. I call them industrialists or industrial policies because they are strong believers in a big industrial policy across the board. This is kind of like Orrin Cass is maybe a leading figure of this. I think J.D. Vance is certainly in that camp. Marco Rubio is in that camp. And they would like to see the full suite of policy tools used to not just advance American technology, but also to try and like build American factories and make a much more equitable, although they won't use that word, distribution of economic goods across the United States. And these guys, this top left industrial policy camp, my personal read at this point in the administration is actually they're not having too many big wins. They have a lot of intellectual wins, and they support tariffs. So if you consider tariffs a win for them, that then like they've got something. But there's not a lot of appetite in the administration thus far for the sort of spending that these guys imagine. And that's maybe the weakness of their approach, is that if you're going to do hard level industrial policy, it's hard to do it without also raising taxes or raising the deficit. And Republicans are very allergic to both of those. And so that gives you three of the four camps. I'll just say one more thing just about the bottom left camp, which is the trade warriors, because that's there's something about this that's not obvious to people, which is that a lot of people who are attracted to tariffs are often critics of industrial policy writ large. They didn't like the CHIPS Act. And they actually are, in their own way, they're critics of the administrative state. They don't believe that government can do this well. But they nevertheless believe that tariffs might be able to. And this kind of seems like a contradiction in terms, but it isn't necessarily. Because if you think about it, tariffs are extremely, although high impact, they're low bureaucracy. USTR has 200 people. Maybe they need to sign 100 people more on to have negotiations with every country in the world right now. But if you want to basically have the sort of industrial policy that you could run on a night watchman state, the sort of state that America had in the 19th century, well, that's how America did it in the 19th century, is using these tariffs as your lever. And so if you want to kind of do the doji thing where you're tearing down the federal government without reducing the ability to bring back this industrial renaissance, you're often very attracted to the tariff position.
Okay, Tanner, a challenge for you. Let's use Laura Loomer as our hinge to explaining Trump world's views of geopolitics.
Well, maybe do we need to give background for people who don't know what happened with Laura Loomer? Maybe you should tee it up first. I think not everyone will have seen that piece of news in the middle of all the tariff stuff.
I don't know if I can tee up Laura Loomer, but all right, I'll try. Okay, so yeah, I mean, why don't you? Can you explain her in 4 sentences? I feel like you have a better sense of her mind space.
Sure. Laura Loomer is a media personality / activist on, I would say, the MAGA right. And she was influential in the election, and she was a constant ally of Trump during the election. She stayed with him during the primaries. And one of the things she's been big about is policing Trump world to make sure that rhinos, Republicans in name only, do not get important administrative posts in this election. I mean, in this new administration, because the theory is that a lot of the stuff that Trump wanted to do last time around didn't happen because he had people who were working against what Trump wanted. I dispute this theory, but we can talk about that in a minute. The key thing here is that the other day she came to the White House with a dossier of people that she had evidence of some sort that they were never Trumpers at one point in their life and were disloyal to Trump's current program and they need to be let go. And it looks like Trump let go several of them. Importantly, the people that have been let go, by my count, there was 3 people in the National Security Council. This morning, it was released that the head of the National Security Administration, or agency, the NSA, and the number 2 of the NSA were also both let go, presumably because of whatever Laura Loomer was presenting in this dossier. But on the flip side, not everybody that she's targeted has been let go. There's people like Alex Wong or Ivan Kapanathy on the NSC who she's targeted many times in public who still have their jobs. So that's basically what happened. She came in, gave a briefing, people got fired.
Try as she might, though, Laura Loomer will have a very difficult time firing once never Trumper Vice President J.D. Vance. So good luck to her.
She's also a member of the tribe and has a huge bone to pick with Elon, particularly for the China connections that he has, which is interesting because this is not really something that's come up all that much.
Well, and she's not the only one from that faction, right? Like Stephen Bannon also has gone on the warpath against Elon for months for very similar reasons. I mean, so there's 2 ways you can look at what happened. You can look at it kind of as the way you were suggesting in the very beginning of this podcast, which is, oh, isn't it crazy that we have far-right internet personalities firing people in the National Security Administration, in the National Security Council. Obviously, we're not going to have good policy. Or you can look at this as a fight within the Trump administration itself between these different factions that I've kind of identified. And I suspect the second is the right way to look at it. I suspect that Loomer is just as much an agent of these forces or of these people inside the administration that she wants to help as she is a completely outside force. And this is a way for people who dislike some of the policies these people might be pushing for to bring it to Trump's attention that doesn't seem self-serving in their own way. I don't know if that's true, but if true, it's very clever. But it wouldn't surprise me at all to find out that there's people in the administration who helped tee this whole thing up. Because where does Loomer learn all this stuff in the first place? How does she know, the long details of what David Fye thinks or not? She's not part of that sphere. But there are people who are part of that sphere who know Laura Loomer. And so that's my guess at how this actually happened.
It's a hit job. We've got people paying libs of TikTok and other influencers to dig up dirt. It's like internal cancel culture. It's beautiful.
Well, it's not that new or unusual, frankly, in the long history of American politics for people to do this sort of thing, to take it's not that different actually from leaking something to the New York Times to discredit somebody internally. It's just the difference is Trump doesn't care about what the New York Times thinks, whereas he will give an audience to Laura Loomer. The dynamics are not that different.
JD Vance and other cabinet officials sit there while she berates them, which is kind of which is another level of wildness, I think.
But did JD Vance mind? For all I know, he was one of the people who was... He's on the opposite side of these debates from the people that were released. So in some ways, this is to JD Vance's benefit, assuming he's actually, he cares about the political program that he wants to do, which I think is true. I think unlike Trump, he's more of a true ideological believer. Maybe Vance could say that thing that you had Hitler saying in the bunker one day in the future, but he's enough of an ideologue to actually believe in ideas as such.
For sure. There was this quote from Time magazine. Vance had an interview there back in 2021. Vance told Time, "Trump is the leader of this movement. And if I actually care about these people, like his constituents, and the things I say I care about, I just need to suck it up and support him." So that's 2021 Vance. I think, I'd agree. I think that's very consistent with how he is now. He does have a definite ideological vision.
I think the two consistent things with Vance in this time is, number one, he views his job as vice president to be the prime public defender of Trump, period. Kind of like how Nixon was with Eisenhower. The idea being that Eisenhower could stay above the fray and Nixon would do all the hard stuff. Trump doesn't necessarily want to stay above the fray all the time, but I think it's a very similar sort of dynamic. And then a second thing is when it comes to personnel or people and influencing policy that is one level below where Trump is at, you see his concerns manifest. He definitely has a project.
I will say, I know you dismissed earlier the sort of quality of staff work, but there is not a deep bench for this stuff. And, if you want to press a button as a president and have it create a certain outcome, you are going to need people to cross I's and dot T's. And the more this happens, the more you have to resort to more and more junior people who are just not going to know how to fly the plane. So,
if I was dismissive of that, I didn't mean to be. I think it's a real concern, and it's a real problem. Look, the Trump administration has what might be called a red and experts problem. If you know your Chinese...
I was going to go to 1930 Stalin as well, so I'm glad we're on the same... I'm glad we're on the same level, Tanner.
I'm going to give you... I have an essay that I'm writing about this, then you'll eventually see it, and it's going to be called Red and Experts. And I'll give you a non-totalitarian example of this, though, once I introduce the idea for people who don't know. Red and Experts is the phrase that basically has been used in communist systems, especially in China, 有红有专, to describe the kind of people that Mao wanted to have running his systems. Communists come to power, they have a problem. The median person in the bureaucracy belongs to the bourgeois class that they're trying to overthrow. They believe rather strongly that the preferences of people from this class are orthogonal to the program they want to implement. So what do? Do you have these, bad class element experts in charge, or do you have Reds who don't know what they're doing but are believers in the program? Ideally, you can get people who are both Red and expert, but otherwise you have to find a way to triangulate this problem. And this has been a consistent problem throughout much of human history. Whenever you have one group take over, the example that comes to my mind as a very compelling example of this is when Republicans first came to power ever. When Republicans took control of Congress and the executive branch in 1860, it was after a period in which Democrats controlled it for a very long time. Most of the military was Democrats. Half of the military seceded to the South. Most of the rest of the military voted Democrat. And you had Republican after Republican in Congress drag these generals through hearings and protest to Lincoln all the time, saying the reason that we're not winning this war, the Civil War, is because we are not putting in power people who believe in the program. We keep putting in power these people who are sympathetic to the South, who like the old Southern buddies they were fighting in the war, who don't want to get rid of slavery. If we put those guys in power, they would fight the war much harder. They would do the tough stuff that needs to be done. And Lincoln tried it in a few cases. And a lot of those generals who he did try to put, like John C. Fremont, didn't do very well. It turns out that the generals who ended up doing the best for the Union were often people like Sherman, who before the war did not want it to happen, who was teaching in the South at the time, who on his first meeting with Lincoln came away thinking, oh, this guy's an idiot. He says it in his memoir. I hated him when I met him first. I thought he was an idiot. It was his fault this war was happening. But Sherman liked to fight. Grant liked to fight. They were very good at fighting. And if you could get out of their way and let them do their job, which was killing people and burning things and stuff like that, you can have a lot of success. And so if you look at the class of generals and admirals who kind of won the war, Farragut and Meade and I guess Sheridan was very Republican. But if you look at this group of people as a whole, it's not an extremely ideological group. What matters is their competence. And there was a problem in the U.S. Army in 1816 is there was a lot of incompetent generals who hadn't been fighting in a war. And so if the Republicans were looking at the current government now and saying the problem is that we have too many incompetent people who have not had the pressure, like, wartime pressure sort of things, to raise to the top. And what we need to do is just find the people who will be very good and will do what we tell them to do, and will do it well because they're American. If they cared more about that instead of these loyalty tests, I suspect they would do better. I think it's the general history of this Red and experts problem, is that you only really do well when you learn to have Reds who can be in charge of experts.
We do have a 2-hour Civil War history show, which will be coming out soon, I promise, guys. But the dynamic that Tanner is talking about is written up absolutely beautifully by Bruce Catton in his book Glory Road. It's part 2 of a 3-part trilogy about the Army of the Potomac. And yeah, I mean, when I was reading that, it felt very much like Stalin 1930s of there are all these snakes in the grass who are not, down with the program. And I mean, we'll do Hitler again. Like, my generals are betraying me. Like, they did Operation Valkyrie, so of course they were always against me from the beginning. Like this whole, I am losing because I don't have loyalty in my people who I want to do the things, is a great sort of psychological excuse for losing on other dimensions. But in fact, there are lots of human endeavors where you actually need the person with the PhD or the person with the 15 years of experience, as opposed to the person with the ideological orientation.
I don't want to diminish this. People can make a good argument that say George McClellan, 1860, prosecuted the war with less ferocity than he should have because he was sympathetic to the South. People have made that argument. It might be true. I think over human history as a whole, there are lots of examples of people in the bureaucracy not loyal, subverting a program. But in my mind, this is less an argument for, okay, you need to just replace everyone in the bureaucracy with loyalists, and more an argument for you just need to get people who are good at getting bureaucracies to do what you want, right? I mean, Don Rumsfeld was had a Pentagon full of people that he did not had a Pentagon full of people who didn't agree with his program, and he was very good at getting them to do what he wanted anyways. And that's the sort of thing that you should be selecting for. And I do think they probably overestimate or underestimate the number of people who are not necessarily Trump voters, but who will just do what they need to do because like they believe in doing what the government says. There's actually a lot of people like that.
But here's the thing, and this comes back to the beginning of our conversation, Tanner, where like if we don't actually have a vision, if the vision is I am Trump, I like negotiating, I like keeping my cards close to my chest, then the people who are not down with that, oh, let's just defer to this guy, it's hard to point a Donald Rumsfeld in a particular direction because that guy's going to get pointed in a different direction 2 months from now.
I mean, that's fair. The problem with Donald Rumsfeld too is that in some ways he had his own vision that wasn't matching up with Bush's. So like there is like, especially at that top level, I'm a bit more sympathetic. Trump feels like, especially the level of his principles, that various principles in the National Security Council are, and this is the level of like Rubio or Waltz or Hesketh. These people are not, they're pursuing something in contradiction of what I want to do, which is what he thinks about Mattis and stuff at that time. I have a lot of sympathy for him saying, okay, I need people in my decision-making council to at least like not be pursuing their own programs, but bringing the decision up to me. I have sympathy for that. I'm not sure that's what happened here with this Laura Loomer thing. I've seen no evidence that David Feith was off doing his own thing. I think it was more like just a pure loyalty test sort of thing, where at some point between 2020 and now, he must have said something that was never Trumpy sounding, and you're gonna kind of cut him off.
He doesn't get the JD grace. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. Well, should we talk about quadrants? Do we have time?
Let's do quadrants.
Do you guys
Let's
have
do
time?
30 minutes on Laura Loomer. I love it.
Dude, I'm so happy we got to the Civil War. All right, let's get back to our geopolitical quadrants. We have one axis is optimism for American power and capability as opposed to pessimism, and one is power-based viewpoints versus value-based viewpoints of how America should think about and interact with the world.
The first and most important of these axes is just how do you feel about American power? Do you feel confident that America is strong, that its potential is underutilized or unrealized at the moment? Or do you think that America is basically in trouble? Culturally, fiscally, politically, militarily, unable to do what it once was able to do. This matters, especially when it comes to China, because it impacts how you think, like what kind of posture America can afford to take towards China. If you think America is fundamentally weak, you think that like the range of possible outcomes that we can have with China is much constrained. And the best case is something like a détente or a balance of power, preventing them from invading Taiwan. It's the best we can do. And maybe much less than that. On the flip side, if you believe that America is fundamentally strong, you are often much more willing to seek kind of maximalist solutions with China. We can win, have a victory against China. We can force them into some sort of like Cold War collapse. And you're also much more likely to think that there are not trade-offs between China as a problem and other problem spots across the world. We don't necessarily have to like go all the way out of Ukraine in order to focus on Taiwan, because we have the potential resources to do both. We just aren't using them smartly enough, or we're not having enough defense budgets. But that defense budget's not a law of the universe. It can be changed. What Trump wants to have happen will happen. So let's get him to make our defense budgets bigger. That's one axis. The second axis is whether or not you analyze American foreign policy primarily through the lens of some sort of like realpolitik hard power, or if you think there are other values-based things that matter. The top half of my diagram is these realpolitik people. They're very easy to understand. I think a pretty easy model. You think that force is the most important thing in the world, and what matters is whether or not America has it and whether or not alliances contribute or take from it, that sort of stuff. The people on the bottom quarter, they're a little bit different.
The two different camps of values-based perspectives actually differ in the kinds of values they're assessing. Can you describe how those two camps differ?
Yeah, that's right. They're a little bit less parallel than the top ones. The top ones, like more or less, if your calculation of American power changed, you would go from one camp to the other, right? But for the bottom people, they have a similar way of thinking about the world, which is that the international order and the international environment has a sort of feedback relationship with the domestic order, domestic values that we have. And that just like domestically, statecraft should be informed by like a positive vision of what we want to do in the world. It should be informed by a positive vision of the good. Likewise, there's no reason that's not true in the international sphere. People at the top say it's not true. All that matters is really kind of power stuff, and that other stuff is a distraction or it takes away from like the different logic that operates in an international sphere. And the people in the bottom two quadrants, they disagree with that. So what do they say? Well, I mean, I think the people in the bottom left corner, who I label crusaders, these people think that you need to forcefully defend things like democracy, liberty as abstract ideals on the international stage, that by defending on the international stage, you're enshrining them at home, and that things like China pose a threat to them at home. They often look at things like influence operations and stuff like that, and they often view things like influence interference operations as the big problem that China poses for the United States. And then they likewise will kind of have like the reverse version. Like one of the paradigmatic guy here would be someone like Miles Yu, who believes strongly that things like democracy, human rights, these aren't just like good ideas, but they are potential weapons that should be used against the Communist Party of China. Where the communists say all these things are meant to undermine us, all these ideas, these things in international order are eroding our internal regime. Someone like Miles Yu would say, that's great. Let's do it consciously instead of unconsciously.
All right. And then I'm going to tee up a question for the other side. Or, yeah. Let's see.
You say that's not what J.D. Vance thinks. I mean...
Yeah. And then, okay, let's go to the other side of that. The people who are values-based but pessimistic in American power. I did note, in sort of a preview of this report back in October, you called this quadrant restrainers. Now you call them culture warriors. Can you describe what the restrainer/culture warrior people think?
Yeah, I don't call them restrainers anymore because I've realized that this word was getting confused a little bit too much. Restrainers is like a long academic tradition of people being like, the United States needs to come home for all these strategic reasons. We need to be more isolationist. It'd be better for the whole world if we were to be that way. And a lot of people in the culture warrior camp think that, but they get there through slightly different logic. Their main concern is winning the culture war. Their main concern is recreating the American economy, the American politics, American culture along grounds they find less hostile to their worldview. And they have like 1,000 little divisions. We don't have to get into it now, like what those divisions are. The main point is that they don't like the kind of standard progressive liberal orthodoxy which inhabits most of the American bureaucracy, American academia, like NGOs, and much of the corporate world. And these guys tend to view the liberal international order as an extension of the same progressive order at home that they're fighting against. They view it that way in two ways. One is that like the national security bureaucracies that maintain this order, they view as kind of strongholds of the worldview that they oppose, right? CIA, FBI, even the military officer corps, full of progressives. And the second sense is, again, they view there's like a sort of a feedback relationship where the complex of maintaining the international order encases a set of values that is then weaponized against them at home. And so there's no real reason to try and sacrifice American dollars, American blood for upholding a system that they believe is trying to squash them out of existence, squash their cultural commitments out of existence. That's their basic belief. I mean, you could add to this maybe like a third subset, which is that traditionally Republicans are elected, they believe, to kind of roll back certain social, cultural conditions. This never happens because Republicans always get so concentrated on foreign affairs. And so we need to turn down the dial on foreign affairs so that those things can take the precedence. That's kind of the logic of these folks.
Tanner, why don't you connect this quadrant to caring about defending Taiwan?
So what does Taiwan mean to like these four quadrants? The Taiwanese for the last few years have been very big into describing how like, oh, we are like a democracy. We're a liberal democracy in Asia. They've often said things like, well, we're the only liberal democracy in Asia that has gay marriage allowed under normal ways, things like that. This is not only not convincing to these people, it's an anti-signal. It's an argument against their defense. And so a lot of these guys, like, for sure, would not be willing to go to Taiwan's defense for the sake of values, which they don't necessarily hold. They're often going to look at something like competition with China and look for off-ramps for it. They'll view competition with China as a problem only in as much as China has a hostile relationship with the United States because we need to do the necessary stuff on the trade side. And so they want to have a military guarantee so they can do kind of crazy stuff in the trade world and not have the Chinese escalate to kind of like military options. This is kind of how they'll say it sometimes, right? Otherwise, they don't feel like the United States has a huge vested interest in fighting a war with China. They would rather cut and run in that sort of situation. They don't, especially over Taiwan. Some of them might say there's a bigger question about, how much power China has over us, if they're going to do things that will give us independence, take that independence we were talking about earlier. They have an interest in that. But they don't necessarily see the defense of all these allies all over the place as being the fast route to protecting American independence. And often use it as an excuse that the national security state uses to increase its own power relative in the coalition and increase its position in American society.
Can we map Taiwan policy onto the remaining three quadrants? We got prioritizers, those skeptical of American power, power-based viewpoints. And then I think in particular, can you help spot the difference between a primacist, someone who's power-based optimistic, versus a crusader, someone who is optimistic, values-based? Because I think, primacist, they're not going to say, I don't care about democracy at all. Like they're in America. They're probably going to say things that sometimes sound like crusaders, even if it's not as explicit as someone like Miles Hugh.
I think the restrainer types, they do care about democracy as like majoritarianism for America. They care about freedom of speech in America. And so they often view these national security stuff as being like something that harms those things they care about in America. And so someone like Mike Lee, to choose a very, very prominent senator in this world, like he all the time just basically talks about how that like those two things, democracy and liberties, are being sacrificed at a foreign policy that doesn't need it. Or someone like Ross Vogt, who's now head of OMB, who more or less makes the same argument that like this focus on foreign policy has come directly at the expense of these things that we care about doing at home. Prioritizers, they are also skeptical of American capability and power. They also are somewhat doomer on like where America might be. And this affects what they think about Taiwan and China. Most of them, like their standard position, the position that seems to be being encoded in like their stronghold at the moment is the Office of Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon. A lot of these guys have been stalked there, and I don't know if you guys saw the Washington Post report from a few days ago that like went through the memo that was released. There's a new memo that says that Taiwan must be the organizing contingency for the entire United States military. That's not a very restrainer way of looking. That's not a very culture warrior way of looking at the problem. The prioritizers, their view is basically those things that they care about, what the stuff the culture warriors care about, but they think that those guys are a little bit too blasé about what happens if the Chinese become the global superpower. The only place they can stop being stopped from becoming a global superpower is Taiwan, and thus everything else needs to be stopped in order to focus on this. We got to get out of Ukraine. We got to get out of the Middle East. We got to focus everything we got on this Taiwan thing because America is in such a weak position that unless we do that, there's no chance of victory or deterrence.
You make this point at the end of your paper where you tie domestic success on culture war type DEI fighting stuff to America's ability to think it can do things on the world stage and project power and win wars and whatnot. Expand on that for us, please.
Okay, well, just like think of it this way. If the number one difference between the different camps and the policy approaches you're taking is how strong do you think America is? What are the inputs that are going into this function where on the outside is like, you know, people's internal, okay, America's strong or not? And this will change from person to person. Some of these things are very obvious things like the number of ships we have, the number of ships they have. Some of the things are more intangible. A lot of the doomerism on the Trump side is that they honestly, like, they need to make America great again because America is not. Because America is culturally falling apart, because it's becoming progressive. It's becoming a sort of culture that is disintegrating, where people don't feel loyalty. They will not be willing to sign up to fight for the military. There's no longer this martial spirit inside the military. There's no longer this cultural coherence outside of it. We can't get the bureaucracy to do what we need. And so if there is a contest, we're going to be fighting against ourselves the whole time. Things like that will go into calculations that people have over whether or not they believe that America is sufficiently strong enough to deter a war with China or to do anything else. This is important and very underemphasized. I recommend people look up an essay written by Michael Anton in 2021 for the American Mind called, or maybe it's for the Federalist, called Why We Should Not Defend Taiwan, or something of that regards. And remember, Michael Anton is now in the State Department as at the head of policy there. And he lists all these reasons why we shouldn't defend Taiwan, and most of them are about lack of American strength to do it. But if you see why he says we're not strong, he points out the normal things about shipbuilding numbers and stuff. But then he says things like, and we keep crashing our ships, and we have pride flags everywhere, and we have a military where Mark Milley cares more about transgender troops than about readiness. He goes through a whole list of things, which I think most analysts of American foreign policy, be they abroad or at home, do not really view as something separate from foreign policy. And for a lot of Trump world, that's simply not true.
Well, here's where I kind of see the Nero decree energy coming back into it, right? If like the woke people seem like they're winning in 2027, then I mean, then I think the sort of the Taiwan commitment, I imagine, would be a little less clear. No?
Yes. I think yes. I think that there'll be more forces for restraint in a world in which the Trump people feel like all the things they've wanted to do, Doge, tariffs, remaking the global order, if all this stuff turns to crap, maybe there's the argument like, oh, they'll look for a way to like have a war because that'll make them look strong and people will trust them more than Democrats or whatever. Like, I suppose it's a possibility. But my intuition is that if we look like Trump has been in power for 2 or 3 years and America's in a worse position culturally, economically, politically than it was when he came into power, then this will translate into a larger percentage of Trump people around Trump feeling like America is not capable of like standing up to China, or that it needs to compromise and regain strength before it can do so. Hide and bide, per se.
You note in this paper, Tanner, that like they're playing half-court tennis, like thinking about China's aims and ambitions and second-order consequences of what Beijing would do if they went this way or that way. It was never this sort of first layer of thinking that got all these people to all their different quadrants, both from the geopolitical and economic side. Is this surprising? Does it tell you anything?
I asked all these people about what's your ideal China policy? What do you want to have happen? You know, what does the world look like after you've done this? What are the tools you want to use? And everybody had lots of answers on these questions and expanded freely on them. But when I asked the question, okay, so when you do X, what do you think the Chinese will do Y? First of all, no one ever brought that up on their own. Some of them were able to get pretty good answers when prompted, but they all had to be prompted to kind of view this as a we do this, they do this, we do this, they do this sort of thing. And in some ways, like, and this is only a thought that's occurred to me as we're having this conversation, this is almost kind of the opposite of Trump himself, right? Trump is a super tactical guy who just wants to like go one thing to the next, whereas everybody else has these very big plans. They have these, you know, here's the end state we want with China. Here's this program of things we want to do to like help us, without thinking, okay, well, what's their response going to be? Whereas Trump almost is the opposite, where he's thinking, okay, what's their response going to be? Let's do the thing where they're going to respond to us. And I do think that's probably a problem. It's a problem both in that it probably means that branching from or bridging Trump's way of doing policy to like what these guys want to do is going to be difficult. Even if they weren't all trying to do different things, it'd be difficult. And then the Chinese will do stuff. And so I would feel better if more people had thought through what they think the Chinese response would be, especially on the economic side. On the economic side, I think a lot of the people, whether or not China existed, they would have many of their similar economic ideals. For some of them, China is a convenient boogeyman. For some of them, China is a good piece of evidence to use as to like how American economic policy could be better. But very rarely is China the reason they got to where they were so much as like a case study in what they want to do. And I suspect that there might be a few surprises when we act and the Chinese act in return.
Well, let's close on that then. Okay, Tanner Greer, Mandarin speaker, guy on the scene for the Council of Foreign Relations doing the open translation project. Translation, one more time. How the hell are they going to make any sense of this?
Well, so the first question, and I don't know the answer to this, is how much discernment do they have of the intricacies that I've kind of described? If they were very smart, they would try to look at these different factions and play in such a way that like they would strengthen some over another. I doubt they will be able to do that. I don't think the Chinese have a very good track record of understanding kind of like American politics and manipulating it in a way that works in the era of Xi Jinping.
I don't think Tanner is going to be consulting anytime soon. This podcast is all you guys are going to get.
I know. I guess they could read my report. It's out in the public. But
yeah.
I mean, they will be filled like whatever little intern at the embassy reads my report, it getting filtered up to Xi Jinping. I think those steps probably matter. Because I've met or seen some of those people at the embassy before, and a lot of them are actually pretty savvy on American politics. So it makes me think that there's something between the step of like guy on the ground in DC and Xi where things get like messed up. Or there are like other pressures in their own domestic system where people are doing things for reasons that aren't just what the Americans will do back, right?
Sure.
There's a mirror problem here. What will they do? My guess on the short term is they're going to just position themselves as being the nice guys on the international scene in contrast to the chaos of the Trump people. If they're smart, they'll emphasize this whole predictability, unpredictability element I've mentioned already. You can see they've already started releasing propaganda talking about how, like, they're all for trade and all for helping people out and stuff. They'll continue doing that. The more interesting question is, will they take a harder or maybe more accelerated view of the Taiwan question? And I suspect the answer, unless the Taiwanese do something different, I suspect the answer is no. I think they're going to look at the chaos going on in the United States and interpret this as reason for them to have some sanguinity about their previous proclamations that the East is rising and the West is falling. The time is on their side. I think that's probably my guess. They're going to look at, they're going to say time is on our side. We just need to be the calm guys while the Americans are the crazy ones. And everyone will see who's the better bet. Taiwanese will see we're only getting stronger in military power. We don't have to pull the trigger right away. But that's just my guess. There's lots of things that could get in the way of that.
One last one for you, Tanner. So, history is contingent. Trump is a unique figure. DeSantis could have won the primary. He could have gotten impeached in January. Could have gotten shot twice over the course of the election. What was and wasn't baked in given Republican president winning in 2024?
What has happened with Ukraine was not baked in. What has happened in Europe was not baked in. That's the first thing. I think that the general trajectory on the geopolitical side of the department orienting strongly towards Taiwan was to an extent baked in. Now, the real interesting question is, what about tariffs and trade? And I think that a larger reckoning with the current international trading order, I believe personally that this order is not sustainable as it has been, that the costs, I hear a lot of neoliberal people kind of talk about how we just need to kind of go back to Obama era stuff. It's all good. It's fine. I think this is utterly insufficient, especially if you're a liberal who doesn't like Trump. You have to see that this order in some ways produced him. And so I think that whether or not Trump died last summer, we would be having some sort of reckoning with what the order would look like. Would it happen this way? Probably not. But I think there would be I think that the era of the post Bretton Woods era, the globalized era from 1970s to now, whatever we want to call this world, is coming to its concluding point naturally at this point. And the question is just how much agency are we going to try and have over this process? And how much agency can anyone have over this process? I don't have simple answers to that. I think that the Trump team's divisions and Trump's own kind of erratic personality, of course, make that a little bit more difficult to exercise some sort of control against the friction of the universe. But I don't think there was a way where we go back to 2016 at this point.
All right.